All right. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar for the month of June already. Somehow it feels like it was just the end of the year, but somehow it's already June. We've got a good number of people here for this month's webinar. We're going to be talking about rent collection, actually, with one of my favorite vendors, CredHub. We've got Tony here from CredHub to talk about this. He'll introduce himself here in just a second, but we're going to cover sort of what modern collections looks like nowadays and how we can proactively collect on rent and then make sure that we're doing everything we can to work for our clients, to make sure we're actually doing everything possible to make sure that that rent's coming in as quickly as possible. So to get things started, I'll kick it over to Tony. Tony, can you introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about what CredHub is and how you got started and all that?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Todd. It's always great to be here with you. So I'm Tony Milne, President and COO here at CredHub. I've been with CredHub for a little over 3 years now, and CredHub was started back in 2018 as one of the pioneers for rental reporting to the credit bureaus. At that time, reporting to credit bureaus was only negative things, evictions, that kind of stuff, and then as in 2016, the scoring models changed. It kind of opened that up to help people also build their credit. So it was a great time to start a business that could impact the residents while also being two-sided to impact or help the property managers too. So myself, I've been in real estate in one way or another for, 15 years now. Commercial side first, and then residential side, and helping up another prop tech before CredHub too, and then myself, I'm a very small time investor and operator myself too. So it's really good because a lot of things I get to hear from people, it resonates with me too, because I understand both sides of it, from the owner side as well as the operator side too.
Excellent. Well, first thing I'll point out to people, if you have questions or anything as we go along, please drop them in the chat here if you can. We want to try to get to those questions at the end if we can. So we'll try to keep up with those. Just drop them there as we're going along if anything pops up. I think I should be able to see things, even if they come in on Facebook or anywhere else, even if you're not connecting strictly to the webinar. But please drop those questions in and we'll try to get to those. So first, let's start out with what the actual problem we're trying to deal with here is, because we've started to hear some things across the industry, and I was seeing this actually in some upcoming IMN conference agendas that I was looking at a couple days ago, where it seems to be a more common topic right now about delinquent rent. And it's kind of reminding me a little bit of, certainly not to the same degree, but when I first met, everybody at CredHub was during COVID. That's when I first kind of heard of this, because obviously we were all worried about rent collection and what we were going to do at that point. So that was kind of the last time I really heard people really concerned about rent collection and how well collection was going and how the delinquency rate was, or how high the delinquency rate was. And I'm starting to hear a little bit of inkling of that again as I start to look at the topics people are talking about. What are you seeing because you guys obviously see this more than anybody. It's not just a single account. Like I can just look at my account and my consulting clients, but you're seeing it from people all over the country. Are you actually seeing an increase in delinquency, late rent payments, people being reported to the credit bureaus, or is this just something that for some reason is in the zeitgeist and we don't know why?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it's a little of both of, maybe people are feeling it, but there is a reality behind it too. I was looking at a study from Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, and if you look at all the coastal properties or kind of coastal cities and towns and states, that more than, I think, 55 to 60% of renters have kind of a higher cost burden, call it 30 to 35% of their income is going to rent. And so you couple that with rents, you talked about COVID and so call it from 2019 on, rents kept going up kind of at a rate that was higher than ever before. And I feel like now they've kind of leveled off, but I'm not sure that that the incomes have followed that same exact trajectory. And so it's eating more into that cost burden. And when you look at those states, you look at like Florida, for instance, and there's folks down there that in kind of central and southern Florida that have cost burdens that are like 55 and 60%. I mean, that's not sustainable at all, which is why a lot of our customers in those areas are like, well, we're having to definitely keep rents flat and in some ways actually pull them back too. And that's not good for anybody. With that, as the cost burdens up, then it's just easier for people to get behind. And we have folks that, new customer of ours that are coming to us and saying, hey, I'm starting to see a delinquency issue. And I'm hearing that more and more in the past, call it couple years than I ever did before. So I think there is something actually there. Our current customers, when I look at the data for their delinquency rates, they tend to stay relatively flat. I mean, a lot that came in dropped quite a bit because just having a good tool like rent reporting is helpful in that way. But overall, they've been fairly flat, and I haven't seen a huge uptick or anything just yet. But I can tell from the rest of the market that there is something there that is tangible, and it's not just kind of a gut feeling in that way. And when we talk about delinquencies, we're not just talking about more than 30 days late. Sometimes we're also talking about just those really late and slow payers too. And I think we're seeing more of that, which is kind of an operational impact.
Yeah, I think there might be, I talk a lot in our newsletter about self-selection bias and how so much of the data we get sometimes doesn't tell us exactly what we need to. And I mean, I think this is kind of one of those examples where if I only look at the CredHub database, it's going to seem like it's not as bad because everybody's already being proactive. We've already self-selected for the companies that are doing what they need to do to try to collect rent. And meanwhile, you've got all of these companies out there that aren't doing that. And it's probably really getting worse for them, but we're not going to see it over in the CredHub data because we're already doing the right thing. So I think that's probably part of why the data doesn't reflect just for CredHub customers. But I do think I kind of agree that I think there is a real issue here. I mean, even if we get out of those markets where you do have that 50% of income is going towards rent, which is obviously unsustainable. But I mean, even if you get to the normal areas where it's 25, 30, 35%, we still have, I mean, the last inflation report we had, I think was at 4.1 or 4.2%, which is the highest it's been in 3 or 4 years. So, even if their rent isn't going up, like you said, most property managers at this point, rent increases are minimal, if anything, in most of the country right now. For a while, we had people doing 15, 20, 25% rent increases during the peak. And now it's like, 1, 2, 3% if we're doing anything at all. But even without the rent increase, people can still feel the burden from energy cost, from just general products, because everything uses petroleum, of course. So there's a lot of cost pressures on people. So it's easy to see this. Do you think there's also an element of residents just deprioritizing rent when they get into a crunch? Do you think that, as costs start to creep up, that for some reason they don't quite put rent at the top of the list for what they need to pay? I mean, for some reason I've seen this from people that they're paying other bills before rent. Is that something that you guys see commonly also?
I think it depends upon the market, the operator, and the person too. I think that, people prioritize things that have the highest consequence to them. And so, let's say, just for example, if they're behind on their car note and it's about to get repossessed, that's probably going to take a priority for paying rent sometimes than not. But it's all a matter of what becomes the most immediate consequence to them and what is maybe even a longer term consequence in some sort of way. So if you're paying rent and you know that my landlord, my property manager is okay with me paying 10 days late, 20 days late, maybe even later than that, you're kind of setting a precedence there. And that can be a problem. We can talk about that in a bit too, but that can be a problem in and of itself because you're saying it's okay to pay late and I'm fine with that. Maybe I'll tack a late fee on and that's okay. But that precedent is set there. So I think it just depends upon the person and what their immediate consequence is. And having a tool like rent reporting does help to guide that behavior, to reward those that are paying on time. And then also have, there is a negative consequence maybe to to paying late too.
Yeah, I think and I'm sure we'll get into this more later. I think there's like a multi-pronged approach we got to take to this to kind of, like you said, you got to make it plain that it needs to be a priority because there's consequences if it's not. And I think
Right.
that's a combination of carrots and sticks. Well,
Yes.
we've got benefits for you if you do it, do what you're supposed to do, and there's consequences if you don't. So I think it kind of goes both ways there. We'll get into some of the details on that here in a bit. One of the other things that I've seen lately that I think might um, I think it might just change the psychology of people nowadays because when I get on DoorDash, for example, or Uber Eats, you can literally flex pay a $30 lunch where they'll let you space it out over 4 payments. And me, I'm uber capitalist. I'm always about giving
Yeah.
people options and let the market decide. But at the same time, that just seems like we might be creating a bad expectation in people's minds that everything can be paid in little installments over time and that you don't need to actually prioritize bills and schedule things. So, what are your thoughts there? Are you seeing that might be playing into this at all, or am I exaggerating on that?
I think most people are inherently bad at budgeting, and it's hard to plan and pay and plan and pay and for a lot of people. And so when you have things kind of lining up with when your income is coming in, okay, this amount's coming out and it's kind of spread out, I think it becomes easier. Uh, Credit cards showed us that you can buy stuff now and pay for it later, but then there's an additional cost to that. And all the kind of buy now, pay later things that we see integrated, rather, I won't say the names, but all the brands that we know that are out there, the it's just another way of having a credit card, and it's just extending that cost out further. And it's something that makes it easier for people, but they're going to pay for it on the back end. When we talked about rent though, and I've seen some products where, gosh, if I don't pay it, I can get kind of a loan type of thing that will pay my rent now, but then I can pay that back later. And that's just a recipe for disaster as well, because now all of a sudden next month, not only do I have the payment for last month that I have to make where it's been spread out, but now I have my actual rent that I have to make up too. And that can be difficult. So, kind of staying ahead of these folks and realizing what is easier for people. Maybe we get to a situation where instead of collecting rent on a monthly cycle, we're collecting it every other week or something. Maybe there's a little bit of a fee to that for that convenience that, if you can't budget yourself and have it paid all at once, then you can pay it out over time. I think that people like that convenience. And I think that the younger generation coming up likes that convenience too. And just makes it less of a burden to have to deal with these kind of peaks and valleys of their income and expenses.
Yeah, I think some of that might even be related to the fact that so many people are gig workers nowadays. So they're
Yeah,
instead of just getting like a paycheck a month or 2 paychecks a month, they're
right.
continually getting paid throughout a month instead of just, getting this one big lump sum. So they like to pay stuff sometimes in that way too. And I mean, for people who don't know, I mean, in Australia, it's actually been very common for a long period of time for people to pay rent either by the fortnight, as they call it, every 2 weeks, or weekly. It's not unusual to see rent paid that way in other places. So, I have articles talking about flexible payment arrangements. You can check that out on PM Assist. But I mean, these are things, obviously, to keep in mind. Last question before we kind of move on to talking about sort of traditional collections. When we look at the increase in delinquency rate that we're hearing out in the market, do you think or do you hear that this is happening in certain property classes more than others, or is this a widespread problem? What's your perception anyway of what's out there?
Yeah, I mean, that question flashes me back to COVID times. I think everybody was freaking out and kind of rebudgeting what their delinquencies were going to look like. And I think when you look back at it, a lot of the A-class properties, especially multifamily, tended to not have the delinquency rate increase that they expected. That's probably still a bit true here too, and that certain types of properties have certain residents that may have higher incomes, and so there's maybe more of a cushion there. When you look at other maybe in workforce housing or affordable or other types of portfolios like that where things can be a bit tighter, I think it's more impactful in that area. These are folks sometimes that a moderate small financial impact, like something going wrong with their car, could impact them paying rent next month because they've got to get their car fixed to go to work, to earn money, to pay rent. And so I think that those that maybe are more on the margins are probably getting hit a bit harder with it.
Yeah, I think about we had an economist that came to our PM Resolutions Expo in Atlanta earlier this year, where they were talking about what they call a K-shaped economy right now, which
Yeah.
is people at the upper middle class or so and above are doing really really well,
Right.
and then people below that, it's a completely opposite story. So it's just this K-shaped economy is how they call it. So I mean, I think there is, if you are a property manager managing something like C-class properties on a regular basis, or you're managing small multifamily in affordable housing areas, for example, you're probably going to be running into this more often than, like we have a lot of properties up in Brookhaven, which is one of the wealthiest areas in Atlanta. I don't expect I'm going to have many problems getting people to pay the rent up in Brookhaven, but
Yeah.
in Griffin or LaGrange, lower income suburbs of Atlanta, it's probably going to be a different story. So I mean, you could, if you're like us, if you're managing a diverse portfolio, you could see some parts of it that are having issues and some parts that aren't. So that's something to look at too.
Well,
so
part of that is, the portfolio that you own or manage is what you have, and you can't control all the outside forces anyway. So just control the things you can, maybe identifying risk, make sure you're looking ahead at, what might be happening, and kind of paying attention to maybe how you're screening tenants, how you're handling your current tenants too, and communicating early and often with with those residents. And those are the things you can control, and those are pretty big opportunities for you to control, I guess, kind of control your own risk.
Well, that kind of rolls right into what I wanted to talk about next, which is, I mean, obviously you talk to a lot of property managers all across the country. What do you see as, before you start working with someone and they're just doing collections in the traditional way? What do you see as the typical process from a property manager, and where do you see the holes in that? Why do you see some of the property managers who have been, let's say, less deliberate about collections? Where are the holes in their process typically, do you see?
Yeah, I think that the communication and being in front of it is probably the biggest thing. So, they're always being reactive on things, and rather than being kind of proactive. We can talk about that some more here, but it's very much okay, this happened, now I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to evict them. Now they have a move out, and now they're in more of a formal collection process. And that's even harder to have evicted somebody. That was a bad process overall for everybody involved emotionally. And now the further somebody gets away from you, the harder it is to collect from them. And so then it's just, okay, I've got to focus on my number one duty, which is to lease space, right? To get that place turned over and get somebody back in there. And then that debt kind of just sits there and gets further and further out, and something I don't think about. And I turn it over to a third party collection agency, and then, they're going to take their cut, and all of a sudden, maybe $4,000 or $5,000 might be able to yield back $1,000 or something like that. And so, it's been a terrible process for everybody involved, from the moment that the tenant was late to the time that maybe they finally pay. And that whole process is just kind of broken down all in the middle there. And, there's a lot of kind of techniques and tools that can be used maybe earlier in the process to avoid that situation.
Yeah, thinking about the communication side of this, as I look back on, my business, I've been in property management since 2012. And the hardest thing about this, doing things the old way, was just, it's a time suck trying to reach out to hundreds of tenants, because I mean, let's say you're managing a portfolio of 1,000 doors. If you're managing C-class properties, 300 of those doors could be late. by the third of the month. That's not an unheard of number. So, I mean, if you've got a staff that's trying to deal with that, that is a lot of phone calls, text messages, emails, whatever you have to do to try to get that rent paid. So, I mean, it's just difficult from a manpower perspective of trying to get that dealt with if you're trying to be proactive about collections. And something that we can actually do nowadays is we can actually have technology help us with this to a certain extent. We can actually use things like outbound AI agents to help with collections also, those sorts of things. So there are some technological improvements here that can help. But a lot of it is just like what Tony's talking about, is just we need to be proactive on this instead of just reacting to everything. That's the bigger problem is, a perfect example. So Rentvine is the software I use. It's one of our sponsors too. It has an option in the software to notify people ahead of time, remind them of their rent. Your rent's coming up and this is how much it is. A lot of softwares have that. That's a proactive thing you can do to remind people that they need to pay their rent. So there's things we can do and try to get ahead of this. But let's talk about inconsistency, because this is one of the biggest things that I see as a problem in property management. And a friend of mine from Australia, actually, Darren Hunter, he talks about this a lot, where a lot of times property managers will just kind of do things, case by case basis, which means they'll go down their list of tenants who haven't paid yet. And then they're making different rules for each tenant. Oh, this tenant, I know they'll pay. And, this tenant, well, that's a single mom. I want to kind of be a little bit more lenient there. And they're kind of making it up as they go. What do you see as the problems there when you're being inconsistent in enforcement?
Goodness, that consistency is the key, not only for operational reasons, because now if you're going to scale your business, if you have 50 units and you're kind of doing it, that's one thing. If you have 500, it's different. If you have 5,000, it's different. And if you think about a larger scale, you want to have consistent processes just operationally anyway. But on the legal side of things, you're creating precedents. So if, especially in Ohio, like that's where I'm at, if you can't tell, but that's where I'm at. And if you set a precedence with one tenant and it's okay to pay late or, be delinquent and I don't charge you a late fee, or I don't go through my eviction process on the schedule that I have laid out in my lease form or anything like that, that's a precedence that you're actually setting for everybody anyway. And so if another tenant finds out about that and follows that same pattern, I mean, there's kind of a legal piece to that. Well, you have to give me the same leeway you gave somebody else. And you have to reset that precedence. You have to reset it with everybody. So being consistent is not just about being fair in terms of just trying to be fair with everybody. There's a legal impact to that too. And you got to be careful with that. Back on your other topic real quick too, you mentioned Rentvine and other PMSs that could send out kind of a proactive notification. We have built an AI agent as well that, will send out that notification and say, hey, Todd, you're behind on your rent. You're going to be reported to the credit bureaus in this way. And the great news is that the very first thing that happens is Todd says, when was the last time I paid and what's my balance made up of and all this stuff. And Charlie will interact with the tenant and give all that information back and help kind of guide them on what that means to their credit score, what that means to their what it could mean in terms of eviction processes. To some degree, it treads lightly in that area. And there's always kind of a call to action to get them to go back and pay on that. But that takes that kind of communication burden away from the property manager, where when you're chasing slow payers, they always want to know, well, I thought I made a payment and how much is this and what is this and what is that? And Charlie handles all those questions for the PM.
That's awesome. You send us some information on that so we can include that in our follow-up, because I honestly wasn't even aware that you guys had worked on something like that. That's great.
Yeah, we've been a little incognito on it as we've been building it and kind of getting it out there. It's, as you know, Todd, how AI is, and you got to keep those guardrails tight. So want to be very, very careful with this. This is very sensitive information. And so we've been a little bit operating in the shadows on it just as we've gone, but we're pretty proud of it.
Nice. I love it. I also wanted to tag on something you had said there about legal precedent, because I think a lot of people don't realize this. I mean, I've been sitting in court before where an attorney, and it always happens when an attorney's representing a tenant.
Yeah.
The tenant never thinks to do any of this stuff themselves, but if the tenant has an attorney with them, they're going to have you as the property manager or whoever's representing you on the stand, and they're going to start asking questions like, well, what about these late fees? You've got $400 in late fees that have built up here over the last few months. How about we just get rid of those? Why do those need to be there? Do you ever waive late fees for tenants? And they're going to ask you that, or a smart attorney will ask you that. And if you can't honestly say no, well, now you're in a situation where the judge is going to look at that and say, well, if you're not waiving it, why aren't you waiving it for him when you waived it for these others? I'm not going to award that in my judgment. So even if you're getting awarded the rent, you're not getting the other stuff because of that. So that's why this stuff is consistent, because precedent is a real thing, not just legal precedent in case law, but precedent in what have you done in the past? If you've done this for other people, you need to do it for this person too. So, got to keep that stuff in mind. Consistency is key for that reason.
100%.
Okay, so let's talk about the hidden operational cost of all this, because I think what one of the biggest takeaways I think people would like to think of from this is that it's not just that the rent isn't being collected and the owner is upset about that. It's that wears on people in your company, because this is, I always say the biggest things that we do in property management are repairs, leasing, and collections. That's like 90% of property management lumped into three different things right there. So this is one of the big three. And if all of your people all the time are getting hit constantly from unhappy owners, and they're constantly dealing with tenants who aren't paying on time, all of this stuff starts to wear on your team. So, when you're talking to property managers out there, Tony, what are you hearing from people about how, number one, how bad is it when they're starting out, and how is morale affected by it, and how does it improve after they get a decent process in place?
Collections is a hard game. That is not a game that is fun to play. You're telling people, I need to pay these, you need to pay me. These are the consequences that are involved with that. And, sometimes those consequences are pretty bad when we talk about evictions, and, some people waive that in front of residents in that way. And that's a hard thing. And most people that are late or, very delinquent or anything like that, there's a reason. It's not typically just because they chose not to pay you. And so you've got to deal with the kind of emotional burden on that too, that you're hearing these stories about why these things happened. It's this question. When I was in college, I was actually a debt collector on credit cards for a credit card processing company. And the number of stories you hear, I mean, there's a lot of really kind of, call them fake stories, but there's a lot of heart-wrenching things. And this is something that a property manager has to listen to, and that takes a toll on people. So that's not easy, just emotionally. When we talk about the time that it takes, you mentioned earlier, you've got to follow up on all these things. You got to call all these people. You got to look at what the ledgers look like. You got to come up with all this information. And, maybe per outreach, per tenant, it could be 30 minutes. And if you've got, like you said, 100 leases that are delinquent, both from the standpoint of active performing leases to post move outs, you've got to come up with 100 times 300. That's a lot of time that a property manager that is also there trying to lease space and keep their existing tenants happy by, performing maintenance and other duties too. That's a lot of time taken away from that.
Yeah, I always tell people, if you're getting on a phone call, you can pretty much plan it's going to be 15 minutes. There's almost no phone call you're going to make as a property manager that's going to be less than 15 minutes. You're not just getting on and off that phone. You're going to, like you said, you're going to hear somebody's story, which could be real or it might not be, but you're going to hear some sort of story. And it's going to take time to work through that, especially if you're trying to be empathetic. If you're in that role, hopefully you are, and you're able to do. I'm not that person, but I've got team members who can do that.
Right.
And they're trying to actually listen to this person and empathize and understand what's going on and try to get them to the point where they can solve the problem. That takes time. So it's not a quick thing, and it's not an easy thing emotionally for people either. But then there's also another side of this, which is, it doesn't just weigh on the team that way. It can also have downstream effects. So you could have, more tenant turnover and also more owner turnover, just because you don't have the right systems in place to proactively deal with this, and you're having to evict more people, like you said earlier, because you're becoming reactive. So it becomes an eviction situation instead of a collection situation. Or you just have owners who are terminating just because they're tired of not getting their rent paid on time. And we all know in the industry that if you got high turnover, if churn is high, whether it's resident or owner, that's demoralizing in and of itself, not to mention a drain on resources. So any thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, keeping your current customers happy is critical. And so, a property manager has two customers, the resident and the owners, right? And so keeping the owners happy too, in terms of keeping that cash flow going and everything is extremely important. There's always going to be different delinquency rates that an investor would have to just understand based upon their type of property and their market and everything else too. But when those get kind of out of band, I think maybe investors look at that as that's on the property manager. What are you guys doing? Are your processes not right? Why aren't you taking care of my property? And I think that those questions are maybe amplified maybe in some of the smaller investors or the accidental landlords where, things are tight. If I have maybe one property or two or anything like that, I personally have to make that mortgage payment each month. And so you have to deal with those people probably more frequently than maybe a larger investor that might have a couple hundred or a couple thousand properties even. But it doesn't matter the scale. If your delinquency rates are higher than what they should be, there could be a reflection back on you as a property manager. And you want to make sure that you're doing everything you possibly can to keep that at a good rate. And if it is high and it is out of band, you probably should have good reasons for that. It might be things that are maybe just very specific to your market or very specific to a situation, or maybe they've just hired you in the past year and you haven't quite gotten things in a good process yet because the incumbent property manager wasn't doing a great job at screening and making sure that tenants were paying on time. And so you're trying to not only rectify kind of people's precedents that had been set before, but now as there's turnover of tenants, just naturally you want to find better quality tenants. So it's going to be a longer term to get things rectified under the new property management.
Let's move into what proactive management of this actually looks like. So we've talked a little bit about communications. We've kind of hit on that, but obviously CredHub's, claim to fame is credit reporting. So when people hear credit reporting, they think, well, that doesn't sound proactive. That sounds reactive. Someone doesn't pay the rent, it gets reported, or they paid the rent and it gets positively reported, one way or the other, but it sounds reactive. So kind of explain to people why having credit reporting is a proactive way of dealing with this.
Yeah, I mean, one, we start off with communication to the residents, telling the residents, hey, this is going to be reported on your credit report. It's great because if you're paying on time, you're going to continue to, you're going to build up your credit over time. It happens pretty quickly too. It's a great asset on your credit report. And also if it's delinquent, that will be reported too. And so folks know that going into it. They know it going into it at the lease process. They know it ongoing through their payment processing too, knowing that their rent is being paid on time, or if their rent is being paid on time, it's getting reported to the credit bureaus as on time. And if they're late, that is getting reported late as well. If they're a little behind within the 30 days, it's getting reported with a balance. And after 30 days, it's just like a credit card or any other type of trade line where it's showing 30 days delinquent, 60 days, and so on. And then with us too, we can do the kind of the post move out side of things. That does sound reactive because after the fact, but getting that kind of information up front and telling the resident this is what's going to happen, good side, bad side. We had one customer, I love this feedback that said, after we implemented, within the first couple of months, our tenants, for the first time ever, were paying early and not even on time, early, because they didn't even want to show a balance on their credit report. And this, they're a good size operator, a couple thousand units too. and to have that kind of feedback from their portfolio was great. So getting in front of it early, making that communication to the residents early and often kind of keeps that in line. I think from another standpoint is just being proactive. If you're setting a goal, okay, we want our delinquency rates to be this, we want our slow payment rate maybe to be this, and then regularly every month at the same time, snapping that chalk line and looking at what those numbers look like and measuring yourself month over month over month with just trying to set a goal to either stay the same or be better. That's another way of trying to stay proactive and ahead of the game.
Yeah, this kind of ties into other things that I've talked about in the newsletter too, like lease renewals, or being upfront and reminding people that if you use an escalating renewal fee, that it's based on how quickly they sign their lease. Or if you charge fees for people contacting the owner directly, making sure they're aware of that up front. All this stuff is just educating people, making them aware on the front end of these are the rewards. So if you're using something where you have some sort of reward, like some companies will have a normal rent and it's a lower rent if you pay it on the first. Some companies will do things like that. You can communicate those things up front. But no matter how you're doing this, if always communicate that, at the very beginning of the lease, and make sure they're reminded, because people will forget things. So even if you communicated it at the beginning when they first moved in, someone can lose their job 9 months into their lease.
Right.
Or they could have a reduction in income. Maybe their hours get cut back. And then you want to remind them why you should be the top priority for when they're trying to prioritize what they're paying. So it's the kind of thing that you remind people of from time to time. This is why things like a newsletter can be helpful, and that kind of stuff, where you can drop reminders of those things in, just to keep these things in people's mind, because at the front end, that's the best way to deal with this on a proactive way, is just reminding people of benefits and consequences on that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Let's then talk about, well, we actually have a question here. I was going to save questions for the end, but this ties in so well to what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Is there any data, or have you guys collected anything over the years as to what you see on delinquency rates after? And I think I already know the answer to this question. I think you have case studies on this, but what do those show as far as how things change after you implement something like credit reporting?
Yeah, on the whole, our folks that come in with our property managers that come in with delinquency rates, they tend to drop by about 50% over, call it a year or so. We do have one particular case study where in about 6 months, they dropped by 77%. So, the data does show that this is a great tool to impact delinquencies, both from those that have moved out, which, that's a problem in and of itself, but those active performing leases too, those tenants that are with you, kind of correcting their behavior, telling them now, hey, guess what? You're going to be reported to the credit bureau. And that's wonderful, because, a lot of you pay on time, you're going to get that reward. But those that don't, it will be reported as well, which could be impactful for you getting maybe a loan in the future, or even your insurance rates or anything like that. And having that carrot, which, I think it's a big carrot, but also a good stick too, is extremely helpful.
Excellent. Everybody, if you've got questions, please start dropping those in just like that person did. Thank you, Joel, for that. If anybody else has questions, please drop those in. We'll get to those. Another question I have, though, first, Tony, is, and of course, it slipped my mind. I had this great question, and now I completely forgot about it as I was doing a little intro there. I remember what I was going to talk about here. What is the actual burden on the property manager when it comes to doing credit reporting? Because I know a lot of people out there are going to be thinking about this and think, oh, that's just another thing that I have to add to my list of things to do every month, is to get all this stuff sent into the credit bureaus if I'm going to do this. You kind of tell people why that's not really the case, why this is kind of just, an easy thing that fits in and they don't really have to spend a lot of time on it. Because I think there's a lot of people concerned about that.
Yeah, and it's a fair question too. It's funny because from our side, this is just a normal course of business where we make it really easy and automated. But it's a fair question with new eyes. And effectively, we just work with your property management system. We built in a ton of automated integrations where it pulls right from your system We get it over into hours and get it all ready to go to the credit bureaus. We do have a portal where the property managers can come in, they can look at it, they can look at the history. It's complete transparency. They can see how Todd has been reported each month, how he's about to be reported this month. On the odd chance that there's some sort of different payment arrangement that doesn't quite fit into any system, they can go and make some edits in there too and send it off. The folks that do enter our portal and do some work, maybe spend like 10 or 15 minutes a month just reviewing a couple delinquency things, making sure that it's in line with what they know and any payment arrangements are handled. And then those that are like, nope, what is in my system, what's in Rentvine, what's in Rent Manager, whatever it might be, that is golden. I don't need to do anything. We just have it automated. It's fully automated. Or report to the credit bureaus after, call it 5 or 6 days, and it's fully automated. So our goal is to limit the amount of work that has to be done from a property manager and actually go the other way and reduce their burden. And that goes back to Charlie, our AI bot, too, helping to get those conversations knocked out up front, where you're delinquent, Todd, this is what it means to you, and all the information about your lease can be provided back to you, so that those conversations don't have to be had necessarily by the property manager.
Excellent. And yeah, I mean, just so everybody's aware, I mean, I've been with CredHub, I guess, for 6 years. I've had on my property management company, and I don't do anything with it. Neither does anyone else on my team. It's just all automated. Because for us, what exists in Rentvine is gospel. There's never a time, because we just have the timeline set up. We know that it takes us a few days at the beginning of the month to process the move outs. So we just don't have anything set to be processed until after that time of the month when we're doing that. So by the time that date hits and CredHub automatically pulls our data, it's already the way it's supposed to be. There's nothing in there that's incorrect. So we don't have to do anything with it. And it's basically just automated. Now, I did have another question for you, Tony, because obviously there's different options out there for credit reporting, but I think a lot of people don't realize that most of the options out there are only positive reporting to the credit bureaus.
Yeah.
And, it's not really full spectrum reporting when someone doesn't pay their rent. It's just, if you paid it, we're going to tell them that you did. And if you don't, we're just kind of going to not do anything. So, talk about why you guys are different there. What is it that kind of differentiates you from some of those other options?
Yeah, that's a whole thing to unpack in and of itself, Todd. And I think we've had some lengthy conversations about it in the past too. But, other servicers do report the positive side, and that's pretty easy to do, because if everything's paid on time, just report that. The hard thing is really being able to report the negative side too. And there's a lot with that from our side. So we built a lot of technology that automates that. It synthesizes the ledger, pulls out, and essentially as an aging kind of report, and sets up the balances that way to get reported to the credit bureaus. Most of our competitors are not doing that complete reporting. That part, just the data alone, is difficult. How the data goes to the bureau is difficult too. We have to be very careful on what the data means, what that means to the consumer in that way, what the Fair Credit Reporting Act says we can do and can't do. When you talk about consistency, we have to be very darn consistent on that too. And then the backside is the servicing. When somebody gets reported positively, you typically don't get a lot of phone calls. And so you might get a question. Todd calls us and says, hey, what's this on my credit report? What's this mean? Those are a few answers. When it goes negative and there's something that dings their credit, we get a lot of calls. We get the disputes, we get the bankruptcy notifications, we get everything under the sun. And the good news is, when I said earlier about we don't want to add an operational burden to the property manager, we actually want it to go the other way. We take all those phone calls. We handle all that stuff. We handle all the dispute management. We do all that work. And that's hard. And that's why most don't do it. But what we know is there's a positive operational impact too, where, it's not, since you have this stick as well as the carrot, you're able to help correct people's behaviors. And with positive only, you're just hoping that you're correcting behaviors. What we're seeing is that you're actually correcting behaviors with complete reporting.
Do you ever hear from property managers that they've gotten big objections from tenants when they started rolling out a program like this? Is that something that you see, is that tenants push back and say they don't want to be reported or anything like it? Do you run into that? I haven't experienced it, but have you seen anything like that in other markets or anything?
It is occasional. Sometimes it's highlighting the people that are chronically late anyway. Where I do see, honestly, the most kind of hand raising about that is in student properties where, the guarantor is maybe a parent or somebody like that. And they're like, look, I got my credit report. I don't want it touched. It's in good shape. I don't need another trade line on there. Don't put me on. We do see that more on the student side. And it's really easy for us to say, okay, the guarantors aren't going to be reported. Only, the primary leaseholders will be reported. And so that's where we see kind of the most pushback. There's the off thing where like, hey, I'm about to get, I want to get a house. You're just now starting reporting. We're going to get a house in a couple months. It's impacted my credit report in this way. Those are one-offs that always come up. But those are mostly the ones that we hear pushback from, or the ones that, mostly in student.
That's what I would figure, because this is actually, most property managers include this as part of a resident benefits package, is usually how they're doing this. And the reason for that is there's a real benefit to it if you pay your rent on time. I can't remember if you mentioned this earlier in the webinar at all, but what is a typical benefit? If someone pays their rent on time for, say, 6 months, the average tenant, what do they see that do to their credit score?
Well, the credit bureaus say that it can increase your score on the whole by 20 to 40 points. Now, we've seen all kinds of things. We've seen folks that have went from like a 480 to a 620 in as little as 6 months. We've seen a whole gambit of things happen where it can be really impactful. If you have no credit or thin credit, having something on there that is showing history and showing positive payment, it can be very impactful to somebody.
Yeah, I've personally seen, I think the highest I've ever had one of our tenants say was 70 points is what they said. I think that was after only like 3 or 4 months, which was amazing. But I think, in some cases, it depends on what else is on their credit report as to how much it's going to impact it. But those ranges that you mentioned are the ones that I hear frequently. The number I hear most often is like 40 points. That's pretty typical. And for people who don't know, if you haven't bought a house recently, a 40-point change in your credit score is gigantic. That if that takes you from being a 580 to a 620, well, suddenly you're in a different tier of interest rates. That's whether you're buying a car or renting furniture or whatever the case may be, that changes things for you. So this isn't BS. We don't just throw it into a resident benefit package and say that it's a benefit when it's not. This is a legit benefit that people are being offered that can give them, not just a higher credit score, but a higher credit score has real consequences. It has consequences like you pay lower on your car loan, or you pay a lower rate on your mortgage if you move out and buy a house. Those are very real things that they get ongoing benefits from even after they stop renting from you. So, that's a huge thing, I think. And I think it just gets downplayed too much how big of a benefit this is for people. Okay. All right. We're running out of time. If anybody has any last questions to throw in, please do that. I got one last question for Tony before I'm going to wrap it up if we don't have any more questions from anyone else. But my last question, Tony, is how long do you usually take before you start to see a change in delinquency rates, or when property managers tell you that things are starting to improve for them after they start to implement some of these things like proactive outreach, credit reporting, that kind of stuff? How quickly does that usually improve things for their delinquencies?
It all depends, as everything ever does. But we can see sometimes some noticeable impact in 3 to 6 months, and then it takes a bit longer to really get it stabilized out. It also depends upon what you decided to report. If you're doing post move out as well, these are folks that maybe have never been reported to the credit bureau, all of a sudden showing up on their credit report, and now they're calling you, Todd, and saying, hey, how do I get this off my credit report? How do I get this fixed? And so we see a lot of impact that way. So if you look at your total overall delinquency, that can impact it too, and that can happen fairly swiftly. But I would say that 6 months is a really good number where we start seeing some things noticeable happen. And it all depends upon where you came from, and what you're doing in addition to this too. And then over 12 months, we see even more noticeable impact, just kind of average.
Perfect. Well, any last things that I haven't covered that you'd like to throw in before we get people some information on how to reach out to you and everything? Anything that I missed or anything high priority you want to make sure we cover?
Yeah, it's been a fun time here getting this information out. I think that it's, when we talk about collections, it always sounds like a dirty thing, but I think that you can kind of get in front of it a bit more by having a great tool. It's, it helps with that, but it also helps your tenants that are paying on time too. In terms of anything else, I think we give a lot of information out here today as well. And now that conference season has kind of wound down, which is good for everybody probably, we'll be back at it in the fall, going to, of course, NARCM National and several other conferences too in the fall.
Yeah, you're talking about conference season winding down, and it's more just like an intermission because it's pretty soon it'll be picking back up again, and we'll have a lot of other things to get to for national property value and everything else. Well, I'll just throw in a quick plug here for CredHub because, I mean, like I said, I have been with them for a long time, and they're obviously a PM Assist partner. You guys see them in every paid edition we send out every week, and the reason for that is we only let people be partners that I've done business with, and I'm very, very happy with their product. They've done a great job for us. You can't just pay and be a PM Assist partner. There, you have to actually meet criteria that mean something to us. And, we've done business with them for a long time. We believe in them. We've never had problems. Their team is fantastic. So I highly recommend them. We're also offering, by the way, for anybody who reaches out to CredHub via the QR code here, we're offering 90 days free of a paid subscription. So we got a new QR code thrown up there on the screen. Scan that. If you want to get 90 days free of the newsletter, easy way to do it. And we'll have lots of fantastic content coming out talking about AI and revenue and all kinds of stuff. So that's all thanks to CredHub. Just talk to them. You'll get a fantastic new service from them, and you'll get free newsletter. So can't go wrong. So Tony, really appreciate it. I always say after these webinars that we get so much great information out of these things where people would think, whether it's furnace filters or insurance or credit reporting, they might sound like topics that aren't fantastic and won't thrill you, but we get great information out of these things every single time for people, and this was no exception. So really appreciate you taking the time with us today, and hopefully we have you back again.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Todd.
All right, everybody, have a great weekend and great 4th of July coming up, and we'll see you on the next webinar.